I will never forget the words. I was standing on stage, holding an award I had worked for 3 years to earn, and the human resources director leaned into the microphone and said, "You are too sensitive for this job." There was a laugh, then a ripple, and my name felt like a mistake on the program. I remember thinking, wait, what did I say? I had warned about a risk tied to a $1,200,000 client project, and they made me look like the problem in front of everyone. I am Anjali. I ran events and operations for Cedar Fork Restaurant Group, which ran 9 venues and a corporate catering division. My official title was Senior Events Manager, but my job was everything from menu walkthroughs to vendor negotiations for big accounts. That one project, the Founders Corporate Retreat, was supposed to be a turning point. Summit Chambers, the client, was paying $1,200,000 for 2 days of food, staffing, and logistics. I had built the event plan, created the staffing matrix, and wrote the 12-page Founders Risk Assessment on January 7, 2025. I had outlined 3 main risks: single-source procurement for the signature ingredient, unvetted temporary hires for front of house, and a compressed timeline that left no runway for contingency. The human resources director, Mara Delgado, was the villain of my story, but she did not look like a villain at first. She had a smile that made people equate confidence with competence. She managed talent, payroll, recruiting, and for reasons we all accepted, she made final calls on temporary staffing for large accounts. Her consistent flaw was ego wrapped in urgency. She loved the applause for saving money. She disliked anyone who slowed her down with details. When I sent her the risk assessment, I put everything in clear steps and attached the procurement policy we were obliged to follow. I asked for 3 actions. 1, run a competitive bid for the specialty ingredient by January 15th. 2, require 2 food safety certifications for all temporary kitchen leads. And 3, approve a reserve staffing budget of $50,000 for contingencies. Mara replied on January 10th with her usual brisk tone. She wrote, "Anjali, we do not have time for bids. Source 1 vendor. Keep staffing lean. We will not exceed the budget." I saved that email and printed it the same day. I also printed the procurement log where she had initialed a payment authorization on January 12th. I did not argue. I took a breath. I scheduled follow-up audits. I documented everything. The first escalation happened in April during a 200-person rehearsal dinner at Venue 4. We had accepted a single-source vendor for the signature dish because that vendor promised a rare spice mix that matched the client brief. The vendor sent a substitute without notice. The dish failed. Summit Chambers called that evening and demanded a 20% refund for the failed dinner, which was $48,000 off their total contract. The kitchen was blamed because the chef on duty was a temporary hire, hired in through the Human Resources Department without the required certification. I had recorded the staffing matrix with names, certification numbers, and the Human Resources Director's sign-off. I presented those documents to my direct manager and was told, quietly, to apologize and cover the refund. The second escalation was in July. 2 weeks before the main event, one of our main kitchens failed a safety inspection after a temporary lead was observed mishandling hot oils. The local health inspector closed down our satellite kitchen for 48 hours. That forced us to reroute food from an off-site commissary and incur expedited transport fees and overtime. Lost revenue and extra costs added up to $180,000. The chief financial officer demanded answers. In that meeting, Mara stood up and said, "Operational errors," as if that explained anything. She left out that she had repeatedly pushed for cheaper temporary hires and blocked extra training sessions I had requested on February 2nd and March 5th. I did not lose my temper. I smiled and said, "I will pull the training logs." I walked out of the room to get the files and left a printed copy of the denied training authorization on the table. That was another receipt in my folder. The third escalation hit in September. The procurement team did a spot audit and flagged an invoice of $33,000 for a vendor that had not gone through the standard 3-bid process. The vendor was the same one we had used for the signature spice mix. The procurement policy, Vendor Selection and Procurement Policy version 2.1, required competitive bids for any line item over $10,000 and a separate procurement approval from the Chief Operating Officer. There was no Chief Operating Officer sign-off. Instead, there was a short email from Mara on January 12th that read, Approve vendor single source, time sensitive. That email had a timestamp and a sent from header that matched her company address. The finance team wanted to know why procurement controls had been bypassed. Leadership wanted names. By then, the pile of problems included client refunds, a closed kitchen, negative press from an inspector, and a dent in our relationship with Summit Chambers. Each event cost money, but worse, trust drained away. My teammates started avoiding me in the hallways. People watched their backs. The human resources director stood in meetings and framed everything as operational missteps caused by poor execution in the field. She told leadership that I had been overcautious and reactionary, which she apparently considered the same as incompetent. At a leadership meeting on October 9th, she said, if we had followed the normal flow, the team would not have been confused. She did not mention the email where she had told us to skip the bidding. They started to shift blame. The third escalation was designed to break me. Human Resources organized a formal review and placed me on a 90-day performance improvement plan. I was shocked. I had documented everything. I gathered my printed emails, procurement logs, receipts for the refunded $48,000, the health inspector notice, training requests with timestamps, and the vendor selection and procurement policy in a red folder labeled document. Set A, I attached the 12-page founder's risk assessment that I had delivered to Mara on January 7th. I stayed calm. I emailed my direct supervisor and said, please confirm when we will review the evidence I have compiled. He replied with neutral language but did not push back on human resources. At home that night, I did the most boring thing a person can do when everything feels combustible. I made backups. I printed everything. I made digital copies and saved them to 3 devices, my personal laptop, a secure external drive, and a cloud folder outside company systems. I also kept the physical receipts, the invoice for the vendor delivery on March 15th, the training denial email printout, and the refund issuance receipt for April 22nd. I dated each printout and sealed them in envelopes. People assume paranoia when you save every email, but that was not paranoia. That was insurance. The low point arrived in early December. The performance improvement review had gone poorly. The human resources director had presented a narrative. You are the face of events, it was your team, the failures are on you. Management nodded. My manager said, we need to see better risk ownership. I sat through it like a dry branch in a storm. My coworkers were reluctant to speak up. One former ally looked at me and said, maybe you should learn to let go. I felt smaller than I had on that stage when they told the crowd I was too sensitive. I left the meeting and cried in my car for 10 minutes. Then I called my mentor and said, I did everything right and still got blamed. She told me to breathe, to trust the documentation, and to pick the right moment. The moment came unexpectedly. The company had a year-end awards ceremony scheduled for December 15th in Ballroom B. Summit Chambers sent a representative, Alina Morales, to attend. She was the client liaison who had managed our account. I had worked directly with Alina for 8 months, answering questions and documenting every change order. A week before the ceremony, Alina emailed our chief executive officer and copied Mara and me. She wrote, I will be at the end-of-year ceremony and would like to address the founder's account publicly regarding unresolved issues. The email landed in my inbox with a subject line that made my stomach drop. I printed it and added it to document set A. I did not announce I had done this. I did not post about it. I kept working. On the night of the ceremony, the ballroom was full. There were clients, vendors, the board of directors, and the executive team. My name was on the program as a nominee for Outstanding Client Service, which felt strange. Earlier that year, the same human resources director had told me I was too sensitive, and now I was on stage in the same room. My hands were steady. I had rehearsed a calm voice. I did not feel like defending myself publicly. I felt like telling the truth. When the chief executive officer introduced the award segment, Alina stood up from a table near the back. She had a small card in her hand. She rose and said, I want to speak about the founder's contract before awards are given. The room quieted. I felt each person look at me. The chief executive officer, who had been quiet through the escalation, leaned forward and said, we will be listening. My mouth was dry. My heart was racing, but I had the documents. Alina said, we had multiple failures in execution for a major account. We lost confidence in the vendor selection process. I brought this to Cedar Fork several times and was told the organization was handling it. I want to know who made the final call. She looked directly at Mara, who sat at the head table. A hush fell. Mara smiled, as if already prepared to deflect. I stood up on impulse and walked to the stage. I did not move with drama. I moved as a person who had been patient for 9 months and trusted the truth to do the work. The spotlights were harsh. I felt nervous, then calm. I said, "I would like to show a few documents if you allow me." The chief executive officer nodded. I walked to the podium and put down a small stack of paper, starting with my January 7th founder's risk assessment. I said, "On January 7th, I sent this risk assessment to Human Resources and to the procurement team. It outlines single-source vendor risk, staffing certification requirements, and a contingency fund request." I read the sentence where I had recommended a competitive bid and pauses in the timetable. I then pulled out the January 10th email from Mara, which said, "Do not run bids, source one vendor." I held it up so the camera could see. I said, "This is an approval to single source. The procurement policy required multiple bids. The vendor invoice shows we paid $33,000 without a bid. The training request from February 2nd was denied by Human Resources. The chef on duty did not have the required certification because Human Resources hired temporary staff to fill the role." I felt my voice steady as I named dates and amounts. January 7th, January 10th, $33,000, February 2nd, April 22nd, refund for $48,000, $48,000, $180,000 for the kitchen closure. People in the room started to murmur. Elena, the client, stood and said, "Anjali was the only person who kept sending us the updates and the warnings. She told us the single source was risky and that additional staff certification would be needed. We asked for a weekend run of the menu and were told scheduling was being handled. We expected transparency. We did not get it." Her words landed hard, then an unexpected thing happened. During my presentation, the Human Resources Director reached for her phone. She had meant to type a prepared excuse into a message, and in her rush, she hit reply all to an earlier thread. The reply was brief and said, "I approved the vendor to keep costs down. I made the decision. Anjali was too sensitive and alarmist." She did not mean for it to go to everyone, but it did. The room saw it. The chief executive officer read it aloud from the screen. There was no dramatic unraveling beyond that sentence, but the sentence was the rope. It tied the actions to the person everyone believed had control. I did not say anything cruel. I did not gloat. I laid out the physical receipts: the vendor invoice, the procurement log, the denied training email, the refund receipt, the health inspector report, and my printed copy of the Human Resources Director's reply. I also had a witness in the room. A junior member of the procurement team, who had quietly been copying me on purchase orders, stood and said, "I saw the one vendor decision and the skip of the bidding process. I raised it in procurement and was told to stand down." She was small and nervous, but her words were exact. Faced with the documents, the emails, the client testimony, and a witness, Mara did what people do when their pattern is exposed. For a moment she searched for a pivot, and then she did something worse. She smiled tightly and said, "I thought I was protecting the company. I made the call." Her voice cracked on the last two words. There was no dramatic explosion. There was an admission, and admissions are more powerful. The chief executive officer called for an immediate audit and placed Mara on administrative leave pending investigation. The board would review the procurement process and training procedures. The Human Resources Director had to answer for bypassing policy and authorizing temporary hires without required certifications. Her attempt to pin the fallout on me had backfired because I had relied on documents, witnesses, and clients to tell the truth. In the weeks that followed, the internal audit confirmed the chain of decisions. The vendor selection was documented as single-source approval. The training requests had indeed been denied. The procurement policy had been bypassed without the required approvals. Finance recovered the overpayments through a negotiated rebate with the vendor, and Summit Chambers accepted partial restitution and a revised performance guarantee. Mara was placed on extended leave and later left the company under a separation agreement. There was no dramatic firing announced in the lobby. Instead, there was a formal process, a documented investigation, and consequences that matched the policy violations. What I did not do was gloat, and what I refused to do was rescue. A few managers asked me privately to patch things up quietly so Mara would not lose her job because it was messy and people wanted stability. I said no. I told them I filed the warnings because I cared about the client and the company. Covering this up would be dishonest. They did not like that answer, but they respected it. I let the process play out. Leadership did one more thing that surprised me. The chief executive officer called me into his office and said, "We owe you an apology, not a speech. You documented, you tried to stop this, and you stayed professional under pressure." He offered me a lateral promotion that came with a better title and a clean slate. I considered it and decided instead to accept an offer from a mid-sized hospitality group that had been courting me quietly, impressed by how I had handled the crisis. I left Cedar Fork in February 2026 with a reference from the chief executive officer and a small bonus for the extra months I had worked through the audits. There were unexpected details along the way that changed how things unfolded. The human resources director accidentally using reply all unleashed her own admission into a crowded room. The junior procurement analyst kept a copy of a chat export that proved she had raised concerns months earlier. And the client, Alina, chose to attend the ceremony in person, which made it impossible for leadership to sweep everything under a private rug. Those little things mattered because they connected the dots into a public picture. Now, when people ask me what I learned, I say two things. First, paper matters. Save the emails, print the receipts, date the notes. Second, stay calm and strategic. If you lose your temper, you lose the record. I lost an award speech and 9 months of comfort, but I did not lose my integrity or my career. I am in a new role now, and my team respects documentation as a form of care. I learned that justice in the workplace rarely looks like dramatic vindication. It looks like a pile of receipts, a trail of messages, and the patience to let the truth be seen.